Hello, my name is Elaine and today I'm going to show you how to make this fabric bookmark. It's a beginner level sewing project. I'm coming to you from the centre of Ireland, and the reason that I'm making a YouTube video is that I want to share with you all the tips and tricks I've learned on my sewing journey and to share how rewarding sewing as a hobby can be. The fabric bookmark I'm going to make today fits suitable for an average size library book, but we can also adapt the size, and I'll show you later. This is a much smaller fabric bookmark and it is suitable for my Italian phrase book, so less protruding in my handbag. So the next time you see me, I'll be at my sewing machine and we'll go through all the tools and notions we'll need to complete this project today. So apart from a basic sewing machine and an iron, the items we'll need today to complete our fabric bookmark are here on my pink cutting mat. The fabric bookmark that I plan to make today will finish at roughly 2.5 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall. So I need to cut my fabric at 3 inches wide by 9 inches tall, and I need 2 pieces. So this is my fabric. It's cotton fabric. I would recommend, if you're a beginner, to use cotton fabric for this project. Denim could work, but it's bulky. You'll need a special needle. It's more challenging to work with. So if it's your first time to make a bookmark, I would recommend using cotton fabric. My fabric bookmark has a bit of depth to it, and that's because I've added some cotton wadding left over from a quilt. If you don't have cotton wadding, you could use flannel from an old pyjamas, say, or some muslin, just something to give it that bit of extra structure so it's not too floppy. I've added a fabric ribbon to my bookmark, and I'm going to add this ribbon to my bookmark today. This was just left over from a box of chocolates that came with a ribbon on them, and it was too nice to throw away, I thought. You'll need a ruler to mark your fabric, a scissors. Now I would recommend a fabric scissors, a kitchen scissors or a crafting paper scissors. You could make it work, but it wouldn't be ideal, as you'll end up with probably jagged edges and frayed fabric, and ideally a fabric scissors when you're cutting into cotton fabric. A pen, and this is I'm using this pen really because of the top of the lid, because when you're turning out your fabric bookmark, this is ideal. It's not too sharp, to just poke into those corners and to give a neater finish. The pencil to mark your fabric before you cut it out, some thread for your sewing machine, and some pins. Now I do have some extra notions here that I'll be using, and I have them off the cutting mat because these are not essential, and these are just items that, as I've sewed more, I've seen them used by other sews and they came recommended, and I'll talk to you through these as I use them today, but as I say, not essential to complete your fabric bookmark. So the next step is to take your fabric and take it across to the iron and press. As you can see, my fabric is quite creased, and if your flannel or wadding needs a press too, do that in the same step. So the next time you see me, I'll be back here, and my fabric will be pressed, and we'll cut out our fabrics and progress with the project. So I'm back from the iron, and I've pressed my fabric and my wadding, and I've cut my piece of ribbon at 4 inches, which for me is a nice size for my fabric bookmark. I'm going to measure out my fabric. I need 2 pieces at 9 inches by 3 inches. So I'm actually going to cut out one piece at 9 by 6 and then subsequently cut it in half. So I'm going to lay my ruler on my fabric at the 6 mark. Here I'm letting it overlap slightly because I know I don't have a straight edge, and I'm leaving a bit at the bottom here as well because this isn't straight either. So if I was marking this fabric and cutting out with a fabric scissors, I would just mark it the top, the side and the bottom. Cut that out with my fabric scissors and then use my ruler to trim off the edges so I have my 9 by 6. But I'm actually going to use a rotary cutter today. So I am going to use my rotary cutter on my cutting mat. Very important when you're using a rotary cutter to use a cutting mat to protect your surface. So very carefully up to the edge, down the other side. And then I kind of tend to move my body when I can so the rotary cutter is rolling away from me rather than towards me. So let me see. Yeah, sometimes at the corners you get some threads. Now, so I still have some crooked edges here, so I'm going to turn it around and I am going to, this is a 9.5 inch ruler, so I'm just going to leave a 1/2 inch protruding over this side of the ruler and bring up this straight edge to the 6. So my 2 straight edges are here and here. And now I'm going to turn my rotary cutter out, and then I'm going to trim the other 2 sides. And now I'm going to cut it in half. So I need 2 pieces at 3 by 9. There they are. And now my wadding is the same, 3 by 9. So again, this isn't straight either, so I'm leaving overlaps on either side. Now, so the way we're going to lay these out is we're going to have our wadding on the bottom. This fabric has a right and a wrong side, so I'm going to have the wrong side laid down on my wadding, and then I'm going to have my other piece of fabric on top, so the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. Now I'm going to put my fabric ribbon in between the cotton fabric, not in between a fabric layer and the wadding, in between the cotton fabric. So I'm just roughly going to eyeball this. That looks about right. And pin that first. Put the other fabric on top of that. Pin around these at the top. And now I'm going to go all the way around and leave a gap, a turning gap, about 1.5 inches or 2 inches. So you can use as many pins as you're comfortable with to help secure the layers. Now you could mark your turning gap with a pencil or a pen, just so it's visible and that you don't sew over it. And I'm going to go back up to the top and then just pin my ribbon through all the 3 layers. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'll meet you there. So I'm at my sewing machine now and I have it all set up and ready to go. I've checked that I have enough thread to complete my project. My stitch length is set to 2. My sewing machine's tension is set between 4 and 5, but of course your machine will have a different configuration. This is a walking foot, which I normally use when I'm doing large scale quilting projects. I could put it on for this project, but I don't think I need it. But if you have a walking foot, absolutely, you know, attach it and use it for this project. I've taken a few test stitches just to test my tension, but this also serves as a way of ensuring that I don't get any tangles or nesting at the beginning of my project. I'm going to use the side of my pressure foot as a guide. It's slightly over 1/4 inch, and as you can see I've got my turning gap marked here, so I'm not going to stitch between these 2 marks. I'm going to start at the bottom mark. So in under the pressure foot and drop down my foot, lower my needle, and I'm going to take a few backs. I'm going to sew a couple of stitches and then back stitch just to secure the stitching. Now I'm coming up to a pin, so slow down, stop and take out your pin and then go again. Now at about 1/4 inch, sometimes it lands perfectly and sometimes it doesn't. I'll just take another stitch here, pivot, and always leave your needle in your work. Now I've made quite a few bookmarks, so I'm kind of speeding along here, but if you're new, just absolutely take your time, lower your sewing machine speed. Lift my pressure foot, take a few more stitches. Now I'm coming to the top of my bookmark, and if you remember, our ribbon is at the top, so it's kind of quite bulky here. So I'm going to stitch and keep to my 2 stitch lengths, and then when I'm coming up to the ribbon, I'm going to increase it to 2.5. Now up to 2.5 now. Now I'm over my ribbon and I'm actually going to backstitch just to make sure that ribbon stays and is secure. Back down to a 2. Now we're on the home stretch on the last side. And now I'm coming to my other mark, the turning gap. So stop with my needle in the down position, back stitch a couple of times just to make sure that when we're turning it out, the stitches stay. So that's it for now. I'm gonna snip my piece of scrap fabric and I'm gonna put that under the machine again, and then have that set up for the next time. So snip my threads, take out my last pin in the center. Now I'm going to clip my corners, because if we don't, we'll end up with a lot of bunching in the corners and we won't get them straight. So just, you know, not even up to the stitches, as near as you can without cutting into the stitches you've just done on all 4 corners. Now I like to trim back the batting. It just takes out some of the bulk when we're doing our top stitching and makes for a flatter project. I'll do the top and the bottom first. Just kind of get your fingers, hold down the cotton fabric for your exterior layers. It's a little bit fiddly, but I think it's worth it. I know you can't see, but I'm actually holding down the cotton fabric. I'm being careful not to cut my fabric or into my stitches. Now last side. More awkward for me trying to do this on camera, but we got it done. Now, so now that's all. What's left to do here is reach inside your turning gap in here and just, you know, it's a little bit fiddly, but just get in here and turn it right sides out. Just use all your fingers. And here's our ribbon, so that helped. Now, do you remember the pen I mentioned earlier on? That will come in handy here. Now to ease out the corners. I've seen some people using a scissors, but I haven't been brave enough to use the top of my scissors for this. Now, I think that's good. Another poke out up here. Now, so what we need to do now is we need to take this to the iron and flatten our seams along the sides and turn the seam allowance at our turning gap under, so we can get it as straight as possible to this side, so it's not really noticeable. So it takes a little bit of work, but with the help of your iron, it's definitely achievable. So I'm going to come back when I have pressed this, and then we will do some top stitching. So I'm back from the iron, and I've pressed my bookmark and turned in the seam from the turning gap, and I've pinned that to keep that secure. I am going to use a larger stitch length for top stitching because it's bulky, so I'm going to use a 3 or a 3.5 length stitch. I've also put a couple of pins just between all the 3 layers just to keep everything intact. I have this bulky seam aid that I may or may not use. Sometimes I have no issues coming out of the corners, but sometimes I do. And when I do, I just slip this underneath the pressure foot, and it keeps the foot level, and it makes for easier sewing, and the machine copes better. I'm going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance around all these 4 edges. I wouldn't use any more because remember, we've turned under this turning gap by 1/4 of an inch, and say if you used 1/4 of an inch, you might not capture that fabric and you'll still end up with a gap. And by using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're more or less guaranteed to close that gap. So I've taken a few test stitches on my scrap piece of fabric, and as again, it serves the dual purpose of testing my stitches and ensuring I don't get any thread nesting at the start of my stitches. So I'm going to start down here because my back stitching will be more visible, so I don't want it at the top. I'm going to start here at the bottom. So I'm going to lower my needle and off I go. Pivot, leave my needle down. A little bit of a struggle there, but I didn't need my bulky seam aid. So now I'm coming up to my turning gap. I'm going to take out my pin and continue. Now it was a little bit of a struggle coming out of the last, I'll just take an extra stitch here. It was a little bit of a struggle coming out of the last corner, so I'm actually going to use my bulky seam aid on this corner here. So I've raised my pressure foot and the bulky seam aid underneath that, and as you can see, it's level now, it's not trying to climb. And this should be a little bit easier. Yeah. And I'm going to use it again here. And now I'm coming up to my start stitches, so I'm just going to overlap them slightly and do the back stitch to secure the stitches. Needle up. Using my scrap piece of fabric, so I'm all set up for the next project, and trim my threads. Turn it over and trim the threads at the back. So I'm going to take out my pins, and that's it. That's our fabric bookmark. Now, sometimes I quilt further. You can see here I done some fancy stitches. I have options on my sewing machine, curved wavy stitches here. I done three rows of them. So I'm going to have a think about how I'm going to quilt this. This, you know, the quilting will give it further structure, but this is fine also. You know, the wadding has given it a nice bit of structure, so you can stop here if you so wish. So my fabric bookmark is quilted. I just done a large triangle effect in the front using a straight stitch on my sewing machine, and I'm really delighted with how that turned out. There are other options, of course. You can do patchwork versions. This one here has 4 different fabrics sewn together and then cut down to size for my bookmark. This one here uses tiny fabric scraps that other people probably would have binned, but I like them so much I sewed them together and I made this smaller bookmark. These make great gifts. If you know a child that likes Star Wars, there's loads of Star Wars fabric out there you can use. Someone that likes surfing, like, the fabrics and choices are endless to be personalized for the person you're gifting it to. If you liked this video, please give me a like and hit the subscribe button. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I really enjoyed making this video. It's my first YouTube video, and I really hope I'll see you again.